The public is being conditioned to look at the sky. They are sold a narrative of hypersonic missiles and advanced missile defense programs, like the one involving AST Space Mobile. This is a deliberate misdirection. The kinetic cost of a launch-on-warning protocol is a terminal, zero-sum game. The real vector of attack is not fire from above, it is silence from below. True vulnerability is not our cities. It is the global financial system's central nervous system. According to CSIS analysis, over 95% of all international data and financial transactions travel through a few hundred undersea fiber optic cables. This is the blueprint for systemic collapse without firing a single shot. This asymmetric protocol circumvents conventional military leverage. It doesn't matter how many carrier groups you have if they cannot communicate. The objective is to sever the data links and blind the orbital assets. You don't need to destroy a satellite. You only need to deny its function. This creates the blind Leviathan, a nation-state with immense, dormant kinetic power but no sensory input. Its fleets are adrift, its financial markets are frozen, and its command structure is deaf. The conventional overmatch that NATO training was designed for, which Ukrainian pilots are already finding obsolete, becomes a worthless liability. A coming solvency crisis, as documented by reports on America's next debt reckoning, is the accelerant. When a state can no longer afford symmetric warfare, it is forced to innovate. The silent vector, the targeting of data infrastructure, is not an act of madness. It is the calculated, economically efficient escalation strategy for a power-facing systemic failure. Financial weakness is the ultimate driver of kinetic risk. The official narrative is a geopolitical contest. The operational reality is a solvency crisis. A state's balance sheet dictates its military doctrine. When liabilities exceed performing assets and the kinetic cost of conventional warfare becomes unsustainable, the state has no choice. It must pivot. CSIS analysis confirms this blueprint in the Russian Federation. The war is not just a geopolitical venture, it is a domestic liability. An unpopular high burn rate conflict drains state coffers and erodes public consent. This creates a terminal countdown. The government cannot afford a protracted symmetric war, and it cannot afford to lose. This is not weakness in the conventional sense. It is the rational, predictable response to financial desperation. The erosion of conventional military leverage forces a calculated escalation into asymmetric domains. The objective shifts from winning on the battlefield to imposing unbearable costs on the system underwriting your opponent. Financial weakness becomes the primary accelerant for systemic kinetic risk. The pivot to nuclear brinksmanship is not a sign of madness. It is a mathematical function of a bankrupting state using its final, most terrifying form of leverage to avoid a total solvency event. It is a launch-on-warning protocol for economic collapse. The math is unforgiving. According to analysis from the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, the kinetic cost of modern warfare has been inverted. A main battle tank, a pillar of symmetric ground power, represents a $5 million liability on the battlefield. The asset now used to neutralize it? A first-person view drone, assembled from commercial parts, costs approximately $500. This is a 10,000 to 1 cost ratio, a systemic economic attack vector disguised as tactical innovation. This phenomenon is what strategists call the democratization of violence. Lethality is no longer a monopoly held by nations with vast industrial bases. For a state facing a solvency crisis, this new reality is a death sentence for its conventional military doctrine. It cannot win an attrition war where its most expensive assets are liquidated by its adversary's cheapest. The state is therefore forced, by pure economic pressure, to abandon the symmetric battlefield and seek leverage elsewhere. This pivot is not a choice, it is a mathematical certainty. The systemic instability you see fracturing allied nations is not a bug, it is a feature. These are not sovereign crises. They are designated gray zones, proxy laboratories for a new era of conflict. The travel advisories for nations like South Africa or Canada are not the cause. They are symptoms of a controlled demolition, a strategic staging ground. According to RUSI analysts, when a state can no longer afford the kinetic cost of conventional overmatch, it must beta test new protocols. We are seeing this live. In Ukraine, pilots are forced to discard standard NATO training, inventing new F-16 tactics because the original doctrine was designed for a war that no longer exists, a symmetric war the West cannot afford to wage. These laboratories are not limited to state-on-state conflict. They are also internal. UN officials warn of lethal force in Iran, but from a strategic perspective, this is a stress test. It is a state calibrating the precise kinetic threshold required to maintain control during systemic collapse, providing a blueprint for other regimes. While the periphery is used for this kinetic experimentation, the core hardens its shields. The recent contract for AST Space Mobile to support missile defense is not a routine upgrade. It is a systemic response, recognizing that as conventional leverage erodes due to the terminal debt crisis outlined in reports, the mathematical probability of an adversary attempting an asymmetric launch-on-warning scenario escalates. The gray zone is where the financial liability of a nation is converted into kinetic potential. It is the testing ground for the strategies that become necessary when, as one Times of Israel analysis states, the coming reckoning for Uncle Sam arrives. These regional fires are not distractions. They are the rehearsals. The nuclear command protocol known as launch-on-warning is not a strategy of aggression. It is a mathematical defense against a decapitation strike. The protocol dictates that if early warning systems detect an inbound missile launch, a retaliatory strike is initiated. Before, the incoming warheads can impact and destroy the defender's own arsenal. This entire defensive architecture is predicated on one single variable, the absolute integrity of its sensor network. However, the digital domain introduces a systemic vulnerability. The very missile defense programs designed to provide this warning are increasingly reliant on commercial components and networks, as noted in recent contracts involving firms like AST Space Mobile. This creates an asymmetric attack surface. A hostile actor does not need to build a hypersonic missile. They only need to compromise the code that interprets the sensor data. This is the fog of digital war. A cyber attack blinds the radar. Is it a system malfunction? Is it a sophisticated electronic warfare probe? Or is it the prelude to a full-spectrum first strike? CSIS analysis confirms the commander has minutes or seconds to decide. The playbook, much like the NATO tactics found insufficient for the war in Ukraine, was not written for this scenario. When a nation is facing a solvency crisis, as detailed in reports like Coming Reckoning for Uncle Sam, its tolerance for risk evaporates. Losing its nuclear leverage is not an option. In this state of economic desperation, the commander is forced to assume the worst-case scenario. The kinetic cost of inaction, total annihilation, is infinite. Therefore, the decision to launch becomes a calculated function of systemic preservation. The digital ghost in the machine forces a kinetic response. The thesis is not a theory. It is a mathematical function. As a nation's solvency crisis becomes terminal, a coming reckoning described by analysts as fundamentally different from prior cycles, its kinetic leverage degrades. The state's ability to project conventional, symmetric power erodes. This is not a failure of will, but a failure of balance sheets. This erosion is measurable. Reports confirm that NATO's F-16 training protocols were designed for a different type of war, forcing Allied pilots to invent new tactics on the fly. This is a systemic indicator of overmatch decay. Simultaneously, the Pentagon pivots, awarding contracts to entities like AST SpaceMobile for missile defense, a reactive move to harden C4ISR assets against a threat vector that now supersedes conventional forces. This confluence of liability and leverage decay forces an adversary's hand. To avoid systemic collapse, the indebted state must escalate asymmetrically. CSIS wargaming scenarios identify the logical prerequisite, a calibration shot to test response protocols and political resolve under economic stress. The event must be catastrophic, but plausibly deniable. Therefore, the calibration forecast for the next 12 months is a coordinated cyber-physical event targeting a primary U.S. container port and its adjacent internet exchange point. A cascading failure of logistics and data, timed for peak throughput. It will be attributed to non-state actors or a systemic glitch, but its function is to measure the kinetic cost of a U.S. response during a solvency crisis. It is a launch-on-warning test where the warning is financial.